Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, where we talk all about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. This time, after the high-flown talk of curses and nightmares, I wanted to start with something more grounded. Church Cannon, a large-sized gun used by the Healing Church, a type of cannon. Its curved trajectory fire and the explosions caused on impact are its characteristics. Originally, it was a thing it was presumed would be used by large men with numbed brains, and for a hunter who is a normal person, it is difficult to handle. But ultimately, it was the same for the big men, who lacked the intellect to handle firearms, and it is said this weapon was disappointingly put into permanent storage. As you can see, the translation here is largely straightforward, but there are two aspects of it that I think are worth highlighting. One that relates to the game's lore, and another that consists of a linguistic observation. So, to begin with the point concerning the world of Bloodborne, consider the literal meaning of the term o otoko. This is a word that combines the kanji for big with the kanji for man to arrive at a meaning that's as straightforward as you'd expect from a combination of those two concepts. Where this gets interesting, though, is in how even an idea as seemingly straightforward as big dudes actually leaves a good amount of room for interpretation, with the chief question coming down to in what sense these men are considered to have large frames. Are they tall and lean? Are they huge in the sense of being fat? Or are they considered massive because they're so muscular? The Japanese term is about as vague as the English in this regard, and in this case, the translators have clearly chosen to emphasize the sense of physical strength with brawny. Now, on its own, I think this is a perfectly reasonable choice. Not only does it line up with the concept of a big dude in general, but it also makes sense to emphasize the importance of sheer might when it comes to the ability to walk around with a cannon. That's a part of the description for the generic one found in the base game, and if you look at the stat requirements for this church version, you'll see that it requires a significant investment in strength, a minimum of 27, in order to wield this weapon. So there's nothing wrong with this translation in the abstract. However, factoring in Bloodborne's lore makes things more complicated. For instance, if you're willing to look outside the game itself and turn to the official art book, you'll find that there's a specific enemy called Kyokai no o Otoko. Literally, that means something like big guys of the church, though in the art book they're called church giants. Anyway, the shared term o otoko means it's possible this description is hinting that the church cannon was originally designed for use by the dim-witted church giants, though ultimately they proved too stupid. This could also explain why the Japanese literally refers to it being physically difficult for a hunter who is a normal person to wield the weapon, because church giants certainly aren't normal human beings. Having said that, though, it's also worth emphasizing that this potential lore connection is somewhat tenuous. While this enemy name also appears in the official Future Press guide, you won't find it anywhere in the game itself, as I noted earlier, and the internal file name found through data mining is actually Irio Kyokai no Franken, or Healing Church Frankenstein. Furthermore, even the original Japanese description never uses the phrase Kyokai no o Otoko, which is the public-facing enemy name. This means there are at least two possible explanations for why the game's translators wouldn't directly make this reference in English. First, it could be that as far as they were concerned, there was no lore connection being made. Alternatively, it could be that they wanted to honor the somewhat oblique nature of the Japanese reference by using the phrase brawny men with deteriorated brains to put players in mind of the right enemy without spelling it out. Whatever the explanation, though, I find it fascinating how such a seemingly straightforward term could lead to such an involved situation in terms of Bloodborne's lore. It goes to show how deceptively simple the task of translating these games can appear. And that's also true on a linguistic level, which brings me to the other aspect of this translation I wanted to highlight: the strength of the verbs chosen for each sentence. I've been trying to pay more attention to this in my own work, because English writing derives a lot of power from verbs. Think of the difference between the simple sentences, "She was by the window all night," and "She lingered by the window all night." I think that example helps demonstrate how forms of to be can be thought of as weak, while alternatives often convey more information. If you look at the verbs in my literal translation of this description, though, you'll see forms of to be cropping up constantly. It's pretty easy for this to happen in Japanese to English translation, but thankfully, if you look at the verbs employed by the official translators, they seem to have kept an eye out for this. That's something that could easily go unnoticed, so I wanted to give it some appreciation before moving on to the next item. Parasite of Kos. The corpse of the higher rank one Kos abandoned on the beach. The very small parasites nesting within in great numbers. They are not things that dwell in humans. This is just one that can be gripped and punched with, and can't even really be called a weapon. But this bug is said to stimulate the spirits of a seed bed. Okay, first things first, note that if I equip the Kos Parasite as a weapon and then switch to it instead of the Tonitrus and start attacking, I may as well just be using my bare fist as far as the animations are concerned. Personally, I find that a little disappointing, since in both languages the description mentions tightly grasping the thing when attacking, but at least this drives home the point about it not being what you'd normally expect in terms of a weapon. That's an important idea to reinforce, because it supports the chief function of the final part of this item description, which is to hint at the connection between this parasite and the milkweed rune. Intriguingly, while the wording in both languages manages to accomplish this goal, the way each one goes about it is unique. To see how this works, let's take a closer look at the logic behind the relevant phrases, starting with the Japanese. In this case, we're looking at the sentence that comprises the final line of the description. Literally, I've translated this as, "This bug is said to stimulate the spirits of a seed bed." But really, this phrasing is far too generic. In the first place, the subject of the sentence should be understood as a reference to the Kos Parasite. Yes, a common translation for mushi is bug, but as I mentioned when discussing the translation for vermin, the actual Japanese term has a broader meaning than that, as is evidenced by the same kanji appearing in the word for parasite from the item name. Meanwhile, as we saw on the empty phantasm shell, the Japanese term seirei, or spirit, has a unique meaning in Bloodborne that refers to invertebrate or molluscal creatures that are associated with the Great Ones. Finally, there's the term seedbed itself, which is enclosed in a type of punctuation in Japanese that often serves the same purpose as quotation marks in English, letting us know that this is almost certainly a reference to the name of the seedbed rune, which was translated as milkweed in English. Put all this together, and those who are familiar with Bloodborne's lore will see that this sentence should be understood as saying, "The Kos Parasite is said to stimulate the beings associated with Great Ones from the milkweed, or more literally, seedbed, rune." Essentially, by leveraging players' familiarity with game-specific terminology and name-dropping the relevant rune, the Japanese wording tells players this weapon is meant to be employed alongside it. The official translators, however, chose to go a different route with the English wording. As in the Japanese, the official translation opens by identifying the Kos Parasite as the subject, and leverages the game-specific term phantasms where appropriate. The big difference comes from the decision not to name-drop the milkweed rune, which theoretically they could have done. Instead, they make a comparatively oblique reference to a lumen wood to get across the same idea. In order to catch on to this connection in English, players need to know that those who take on the milkweed oath become a lumen wood that peers towards the sky, feeding phantasms in its luscious bed. Admittedly, between the scarcity of the term lumen wood, its appearance in the quick description of the milkweed rune, and the relevant quote from the end of the full item description, I don't think the reference is all that much more obscure than just quoting the item name. What I appreciate about this translation choice, though, is that it encourages a deeper understanding of how this process actually works, and in doing so, ends up bringing forward the underlying idea of acting as a nourishing presence that the literal term seedbed implies. As you can see, when using the rune and the weapon in conjunction, the player's transformation is accentuated, and a whole new moveset that takes advantage of this altered form becomes available. Because of this, I appreciate how the official translations reinforce two key concepts. First, the milkweed rune stresses that in becoming a lumenwood, the player character is taking on the role of harboring and sustaining phantasms, much as the milkweed plant harbors and sustains insects. And second, the Kos Parasite description points out how this creature works to enhance those same phantasms. It's a different approach than the Japanese, but one that I'd argue better accomplishes the underlying goal. While we're here though, let's check in with the doll.
Oh, good hunter. I can hear Gehrman sleeping. On any other night, he'd be restless. But on this night, he sounds so very calm. Perhaps something has eased his suffering.
Yes, and perhaps I have an idea what did the trick. Before we get into the lore implications of this short dialogue, though, I want to take some time to admire the translation work on display, because once again, we're seeing how a clear understanding of the ideas behind a given set of phrases is more important than the words themselves. As you probably noticed, a literal version of the Japanese lines focuses not on Gehrman's general demeanor in his sleep, but specifically his breathing. This starts in the doll's first line, where she says she can hear Gehrman's sleeping breaths. Then, in the next line, though the subject is never fully specified, I have a hard time imagining what else his painful always could be in reference to, which in turn makes it even more likely that what's described as peaceful at the end of the line is similarly the sound of Gehrman breathing in his sleep. The thing is, it sounds weird in English to speak so narrowly and at such length about how a person is breathing in their sleep. What the translators have done instead is identify the point of focusing on this, which is that by paying attention to the unusually peaceful manner of Gehrman's sleep, the doll has noticed that he seems to be experiencing some kind of relief. Thus, even though the official English has the doll speak in more general terms about hearing Gehrman sleeping, as well as how he's normally restless but now sounds so very calm, the larger idea of his finding a moment of peace comes across just fine. Nor is this the only example from this dialogue of the importance of focusing on the big picture. We can see a similar principle at work in the final line, though in this case it's narrative function that's most important. The point of this last sentence is to take the evidence of Gehrman's strange relief presented earlier and have the doll say something to get the player thinking about what may have caused it. Of course, if we look at the literal translation of the Japanese version of the line and compare that to the official English translation, we'll find a number of superficial differences. The Japanese is phrased more like a question, whereas the official English is more of a speculative statement. Also, the Japanese gets in the idea that this relief is comparatively small. However, both formulations achieve the goal of suggesting that the player consider what may have allowed Gehrman this reprieve. That brings us back to the lore implications of this set of lines, which seem similar to those of the special dialogue we got from the doll after we defeated Lady Maria. However, while in that case it seems clear that we're meant to associate the doll with the person of Lady Maria, I doubt we're meant to view Gehrman as some version of the Orphan of Kos. Instead, I suspect that we're intended to realize that the old man was tied up in the fate of the Great One's child that spawned the hunter's nightmare and inspired the curse laid down upon hunters for generations. If he weren't bound to the hunter's dream, we may well have found him in the nightmare. Instead, the idea seems to be that one cause of Gehrman's suffering was the curse that we helped lift, since we dispersed the lingering ill will of the orphan. Also, it's worth noting that if this is true, it would mean that even if Gehrman was shielded to some extent from the worst effects of the curse that the hunter's nightmare was tied up in, he couldn't escape its reach entirely. Obviously, that's all speculative, but that there is some connection between Gehrman and the act that gave rise to the hunter's nightmare seems undeniable. With that in mind, then, I think it's worth spending some time going back over what we know about the place, because we finally have just about all the pieces of information on it that the game is going to give us. As such, we can now come to a better understanding of how everything fits together. In addition to this being interesting in its own right, though, I also want to establish an understanding of the nightmare before revisiting one particular line from the translation of the item that allowed us to enter it in the first place, the Eye of a Blood-Drunk Hunter. So let's begin our review. We learn from Simon that the hunter's nightmare sprouted from the misdeeds of the hunters, and that the fishing hamlet itself is the true secret held by the nightmare. If we put that together with the villagers' muttering about Byrgenwerth having committed mass murder, it starts to sound like scholars associated with the college joined forces with the old hunters to attack the hamlet. There are a few reasons why they seem to have been motivated to do this. First, we know they searched the skulls of the villagers for eyes on the inside, and second, we now have reason to believe Gehrman is tied to the fate of the Orphan of Kos. Given the school's interest in ascending to the level of the Great Ones, it seems likely they were looking for ways to do that involving Kos and her child, with the citizens of the fishing hamlet that apparently had some contact with both interesting the scholars basically as specimens. But attacking and killing the people of this village, and doing something that would cause the spirit of the orphan to linger as a malevolent shadow in the afterlife of a nightmare realm, would have wide-reaching consequences. On a personal level, this seems to have most strongly affected Lady Maria. If the physical location of her beloved Dacrio down a well in the fishing village is any indication, she was there for the raid. This makes sense, as she was one of Gehrman's earliest students, and if he was there, it would only stand to reason that he would bring along his protégés. Anyway, after the attack, she seems to have lost her stomach for hunting, abandoning her weapon and taking up a post that involved caring for the experimental patients of the early healing church. Also, at least in the Hunter's Nightmare, she stands in fierce opposition to anyone who would learn the shameful truth of what happened in the hamlet. Incidentally, that tie between the early hunters, Byrgenwerth, and the church is regularly reinforced by events in the Hunter's Nightmare. After all, it's not just Maria who guards the place's deepest secret. There's also the famous church hunter Ludwig, though he may not realize what he's doing, and the church assassin Brador, who is absolutely in on the secret. His warning us about brazenly roaming too far into the nightmare and his continued pursuit once we enter the fishing village is proof enough of that. As for why these three institutions would be so firmly bound together, we may not need to look any further than a character we know was intimately involved in all three: Lawrence. It was his beastly skull on the altar of the Grand Cathedral that showed us he studied under Master Willem before leaving to found the Healing Church, and we've also heard Gehrman cry out to Lawrence in his sleep. Furthermore, we know from a note that Lawrence and an unspecified number of other individuals had an encounter with a mysterious moon presence, something that may be related to the meeting with the pale moon brought about by one of the third umbilical cords that marked the beginning of the Hunters and the Hunter's dream. This web of connections between Lawrence, Willem, and Gehrman may also help explain why Maria was able to take up residence in the Astral Clock Tower, since he would almost certainly know her as one of Gehrman's apprentices. Although, as we've seen, no amount of cronyism would prove sufficient to avoid the curse of the Hunter's Nightmare itself. While the exact details of how it came to be are unclear, it became the vehicle through which the people of the fishing village were able to get revenge by calling down the wrath of the Great Ones against an act of inhumanity towards a child. Yet their thirst for vengeance is such that it extends not only to those directly responsible, but to all who would carry on the legacy of the Hunters. The effect of this is catalogued on the old Hunter garb, when one day the Hunters suddenly disappeared. The rumor in Yharnam became that the Hunters committed some sort of sin, such that they all became blood-drunk and passed to the Hunter's Nightmare. This is where we can finally come back to the Eye of a Blood-Drunk Hunter, because it's there that we find a statement involving an intriguing translation choice following what may be the same rumor about blood-drunk hunters being destined to wander forever in an endless hunt. When you compare the official translation of the final line of the item description to a more literal one, you'll see at what first glance looks like two very different statements. Literally, this is said to happen simply because they were hunters, whereas the game's translators have instead written, "It is a fate that no hunter can escape." Yet with a deeper understanding of the lore behind what's happened, I think we can reconcile these statements as being more similar than an initial reading might indicate. This is probably easiest to see if we begin with the idea behind the literal version of the Japanese. The reason blood-drunk hunters are whisked off to the Hunter's Nightmare truly does seem to be tied to their vocation. Of course, the exact mechanism for this is a little unclear. In some cases, no doubt, it's a direct result of the baneful chance being targeted at all future generations of those who committed the murders in the fishing hamlet, but this doesn't explain what happens to those who are completely unconnected to that event. What the game suggests through some of Simon's dialogue is that the Hunter's Nightmare draws hunters to itself by the nature of the sin that it sprang from. To me, that makes it sound like the nature of the punishment meted out there came to resemble an endless hunt. And since this is exactly what the blood-drunk crave, even those from unrelated backgrounds who were drawn into the hunt in Yharnam eventually find their way there. In any case, the point is that this nightmare, thanks to its origin, is specifically targeted at hunters because of the nature of what they do, if not the legacy they take up. This means that whoever becomes a hunter will have to contend with the lure of the hunter's nightmare, which is basically what the official translation gets at with the statement that it is a fate no hunter can escape. Granted, that wording is perhaps more sweeping and fatalistic than is implied by the Japanese, but I think that helps build intrigue and gets players invested. If anything, I'm a little surprised to see what seems like such a bold, lore-based translation choice on an item description, since we've seen over the course of the series that examples of these are more commonly found in the dialogue. But I can certainly believe it's possible if the item text translation took place after the collaborative process of recording the voiced lines for the DLC. Whatever the reasoning behind that translation choice, though, I think it does a great job of adding cohesion to the experience of going through the DLC and puzzling out the story of the Hunter's Nightmare. And since we've basically done just that, it's time not just to bring the episode to a close, but for this series to go on another hiatus. In case you haven't seen my latest channel update, you should know that starting on Monday, March 24th, I'll be releasing more casual, Let's Play style videos in which I revisit version 1.00 of Bloodborne on my PS4 for the game's 10th anniversary. If that sounds interesting to you, I hope you'll follow along. Either way though, your feedback on this series will be as welcome as ever. Also, remember that if you want to hear my thoughts on any of the other subjects I've covered so far, you can check the Translationborne index linked below, which should be up to date within 24 hours. Until next time then, thanks for watching everyone.